Hi, I'm Scott Martin from Bonsai Matsu, and this is the Bonsai Stuff podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Appreciate it. This episode of the podcast, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about fertilising. Had a couple of questions come through over the last couple of weeks about it because we're in the summer period, and just some curiosity about what to do, what not to do, and all that sort of stuff. So I thought, thanks to the inquiry mainly from Jaden in South Australia, I thought I'd start with covering off what my approach to fertilising is, what I think's appropriate for me and my trees and my situation, and just cover off on some basics too that hopefully can help provide some kind of daylight, I suppose, as to what you might want to consider for your own bonsai and your own situation. So without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so fertilising for me is one of those, one of the essentials, one of the core things that I do with my bonsai that I'm pretty religious about, that I push pretty hardly to as something which is one of the key elements to successfully developing and keeping bonsai for a very long period of time, and allowing you to. It's one of the key components to achieving your objectives, which is, I suppose, more important than anything. So if you break it down to some of the basics things, like the core elements of what your bonsai need. Okay, they are sun, that's a no-brainer. They are water, there's airflow is one that I consider very important as well, removal of fungal spores and that sort of stuff, and just also being in a not sheltered environment. That's where those sort of first three come from. Next thing they need is nutrients through the supply of food, fertiliser. And the last one that they need is soil air, which I'll talk about later. So that's the aeration of the soil, or the soil air cavities, spaces between the soil particles in the root system. So there's some pretty big ones. Sound really simple when you say it fast, but they're the core things that you're going to need to supply in one shape or another. Now, if you're compromising on any of those, be it not enough sunlight because you're on a balcony and you're facing away from the sun and they get very little sunlight, well, there's a price to pay for that. Same as water. If you limited to only watering, at restricted times, as opposed to providing water when the trees need it, when your bonsai needs the water, then there's a compromise. That's a price that's going to be paid somewhere down the track. So I can't change anyone's personal situation, but you've got to make the decision with your bonsai as to where you keep them for the best possible environment to allow them to maximise their potential for growth and for development and for survival. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. So when you break it down as to how, very 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 simply, how you plan how your bonsai lives and how it survives. So as long as it's got water, they need carbon dioxide and sunlight. They can then photosynthesize. So that's when they have the chemical reaction and the plant within the leaves. They produce sugars or food, glucose, and oxygen. So thanks for the oxygen. Really appreciate it, because we'd all be buggered without it. So it's nice to grow bonsai because we're doing something for ourselves. Anyway, so then the sugars get broken down by enzymes, and then that provides energy to the tree, to the plant, and that causes it to grow. So what the plant also needs is nutrients from the soil that help them grow. Now, it's these nutrients that we're adding to our bonsai through the form of fertilizers. So it's a core element. If you break down the soil that you're using And, vast majority of what we're using in the mix these days is like pumice based, I presume. I'm assuming I do, and scoria, but also have pine nuggets in there, which ultimately break down and provide nitrogen to the trees through this form of supply of nutrients. So they're getting something from my soil anyway. It's not like they're getting nothing. And if you're in a pure inorganic mix, well, then this supply of nutrients is even more important. So you need to see it as not as an optional thing that you're doing with your bonsai, but looking at feeding your trees, fertilizing your trees as a mandatory. It's one of the core elements of what they need. So if you're skimping on that, if you're busy doing other things rather than providing fertilizer and nutrients to your trees when they need it, then there's a consequence. There's a cost to it. So, as I said, I'm talking about my scenario, my situation, and what I do with my trees, and I do fertilize appropriately, and it's quite complex. There's a basic approach that I use that I tell everyone when they're first starting bonsai that allows them to come to grips with it, and it provides a core basis for fertilizing your trees. Now, I use the tea bag fertilizing method, and if you wonder what that is, then jump onto YouTube, onto the Bonsai Matsu channel, because you'll see that there's a really short video on the tea bag fertilizing method and the fertilizer that I use. It's not complex. It's not a special secret mix that I go and buy from a backyard dealer somewhere. It's commonly available to everybody. It's an organic mix in two forms. One is a pellet, one is a powder that get put together into a tea bag and then placed onto the surface of the pot and held in place with a wooden skewer, chopstick, toothpick, anything, just to stop the animals from dragging them away from the trees too much. And whenever I water, I'm offering the nutrients come through into the soil through the fine mesh of the tea bag, and the sediment that sticks around stays in the tea bag because, as I said, I'll talk about soil air in a little bit, but that's one thing that sediment can take away. It can take up, it can fill the soil air spots within the pot, and therefore clog them up and have a negative impact on the bonsai. So I keep it in the tea bag because I'm getting the nutrients from it, but I'm not getting the sediment, which is great. It also means that when I want to start fertilizing, put the tea bags on, and when I want to stop fertilizing, I can take the tea bags off. So that start-stop is really important, which I'll talk about. So the approach, this first approach I talk about with fertilizing of my trees is what I call the McDonald's approach. I'm not promoting McDonald's. What I'm saying to you is that you get a certain level of expectation when you go to one of these chains, and it's the same pretty much worldwide. So my standardized approach that I let people know at the very start of their bonsai journey, or while they're still coming to grips with so much else that we deal with bonsai, and our learning curve is enormous, I try to make fertilizing very clear that it's essential, but secondly, that it's not hard to do. Everything I do, it's got to be simple, it's got to be repeatable. That this method is. So the basic method is this. I fertilize during spring, and I fertilize during autumn, and I do not fertilize during summer. I don't fertilize during winter. I'll break that down a little bit further. But so during the months of spring, I work on the basic premise that a tea bag of this fertilizer generally lasts about 1 month, give or take. I don't know exactly. I've never done tests on it, but based on how the tea bag starts to break down and based on the crumbling of the pellets inside the tea bag, then basically I work on a 1 month period as a pretty good window. As again, it's a general rule of thumb. It might be less, it might be more, but let's just stick with for ease and convenience. One tea bag, or each tea bag will basically last a 1 month period. Right, so that's it. So during spring, I'll fertilise by putting 1 tea bag on per bonsai per month during that growing season of spring. Now, I'm in Melbourne, Australia, and we have very clearly defined growing seasons of spring, summer, autumn/fall, and winter. So if you're in a different environment to that, then obviously your fertilising is going to be different. But I'm talking about the initial growing period coming out of some kind of a dormancy period, like a winter dormancy period, which is what I have. So I use 3 tea bags, one for each month of spring. Generally, our seasons are very much almost calendar driven. It's not if or when, it's like now. It's ticked over, the calendar says it's spring, bang, the season changes, the weather changes. So therefore, the fertilising, this McDonald's approach, is 1 bag per month during the season of spring. So there's 3 tea bags used for the 3-month period. Tea bags then come off during the summer period. There's a 3-month summer period. So then autumn/fall starts, and during the fall period, I double fertilise. So that's 2 tea bags per month during the season of autumn. So there's 6 bags. So then winter comes around and I remove the fertiliser. So throughout the entire year, on average, under this very basic approach, I will use 9 tea bags of fertiliser per bonsai. Now, the bonsai pot size changes, and physically, you may not be able to fit as many tea bags onto your pot. You just compensate for it. So it doesn't have to be a hard and fast rule, but as a general approach, that's the approach that I advise, and that's the advice that I follow as a very basic core fundamental of providing nutrients to your trees as one of the core elements that they need to survive. Okay, so I'll break it down a little bit further. I'll talk about the seasons first and why it's important to fertilise during that period. Then I'll go on to variations that I make to that system. So for the more advanced care for my bonsai. So during spring, if you break it down, you'll know that spring is about foliage growth. So I'll just use the basic premise of a deciduous tree. It's come out of dormancy, buds have started to swell, foliage starts to grow, the tree starts using stored resources that it's put into its system to start to grow. One, roots, and secondly, foliage. What happens above happens below, so you start getting the use of existing nutrients to start to supply growth. So I'm providing fertiliser to the tree during this period because it's going to primarily go towards foliage growth. Okay, so that's spring. So then summer comes around, and one of the questions I got asked is, why don't I fertilise during summer? Now, for me, you can. Summer, and I'm sure a lot of people do, and a lot of people listening to this podcast will fertilise through the summer period. No problems. Do what you've got to do what you like to do, but this is what my approach is, and I'll explain the reason why. Now, I don't fertilise during the summer period because we have temperature fluctuations where it's cool, it's hot, as do most places around the world during the summer period. And I find that your trees, when it gets too hot, they'll go into a summer dormancy period and stop growing. But then when it hits a sweet spot with temperature and daylight hours and that sort of thing, they'll keep pushing foliage growth. And my concern is that this summer foliage growth that we get hasn't had a chance to harden off. So when we get our extremes of 40-odd degree Celsius days that we do get, they pop up, or the high 30s, my concern is that new fresh foliage growth that is very soft and doesn't have a waxy coating on to protect it from the sun will get damaged and will get burned. So therefore the tree is going to waste resources pushing this new growth, which is ultimately going to do nothing for the tree anyway. And I find that by the time the trees get into that summer period, they're pretty exhausted, especially by the latter part of summer. So I tend to hold back the fertiliser during the summer period because I don't want to encourage the tree to push any foliage growth. And I just give it a bit of a break, and I focus more on protection from the extremes and providing water to the trees. Then when autumn comes around, we've still got nice daylight hours. Days are getting shorter, well and truly, as they are for us now. If you're in the Northern Hemisphere, you're on the incline, you're heading towards the sweet spot of your spring period. We're heading towards our autumn, fall period in Southern Hemisphere. So the daylight hours are reducing and the temperature, not yet, but it will start to decline as we get towards autumn. And then the trees will go into that growth period again. Won't be as much growth as what we had during the spring period because the daylight hours will keep shortening and the temperature will continue to drop and get colder. So the initial burst of the autumn period will be foliage growth. Then the tree will stop and it will go, right, that's it. I've got to start acting like a squirrel and tucking away my nuts for the winter period because there's a dormancy coming and I need to suddenly build up my resources. And that's the reason why I double fertilise during the autumn period, because it's instead of being for foliage, the initial part is for foliage growth, but the second part is for strengthening of the tree. Now, I heavily feed the trees, and there's always exceptions to the rule. But if you take, for instance, my Japanese white pine, I don't fertilise my Japanese white pine during the spring period because it contributes to lengthening of needles on the new spring candles, and it starts to push out the internode length. So I hold back the fertilising during that spring period of my white pines, but when it gets to autumn, they get extra fertiliser. They're one of the exceptions. So not 2 bags, they might get 4 bags per month because I really want to push that strengthening period to get through the dormancy, and then when spring comes around, they've got enough built up resources to allow them to grow healthily throughout that spring period. They also get a fertiliser towards the end of spring, towards the start of summer too. But that's another whole saga to talk about. So I'm just sticking with this McDonald's approach. So the basic is 1 bag during the growing periods per month during the growing periods of spring and autumn, with a double up in autumn. And the reason it's doubled up in autumn is because it's going to allow the tree to increase the storing of resources to get through the winter dormancy. So when spring comes around, off they go like a racehorse out the gates. So that's basically the approach that I use with fertilising and the reasons why I don't fertilise during winter, because obviously the trees are dormant and they're not going to be taking up nutrients at that time. I'm sure you could, but I choose not to. Now, I do use the organic fertilisers very simply. I don't use the inorganics. Now, inorganics, one of the most common ones that we have in Australia, which I presume is a worldwide one, is called Osmocote. It's like a little yellow granular ball, which often comes in a lot of the potting mixes that you'll buy from garden outlets or hardware stores automatically to provide food to the trees. Now, I don't use those because I can't get the control with those. If you've got a situation where your dog keeps eating the blood and bone that you're putting on your tree, well, you've got to do something. Anything's better than nothing, but I'm talking about my situation. I don't have that problem, and I find that I've got greater control over my fertiliser by putting it on and taking it off when it suits me, as opposed to incorporating any kind of fertiliser into my soil mix for any of my bonsai. It's different when I've got pot plants or something like that. That's another story, but these are trees in pots that we're talking about, and I find that this method of fertiliser application really works best for me and for my situation. Okay, so probably one of the most boring things you're going to hear talking about bonsai is the word soil air. Now, I love it. It's something which I think about a lot, especially when I'm repotting my trees or when I'm thinking about what medium to use on my trees. Now, it's no hidden secret that the soil mix that I use for my bonsai is made up of pumice, scoria, and pine nuggets. Now, equal portions, nothing whiz bang. No 7 to 2 to 15 ratios or anything like that. It's just 1 to 1 to 1. And I've found that over a long period of time that it gives me the results that I want, and it's consistent, it's easy, and it's repeatable. keep coming back to that repeatability. And I know that I can almost bank on the type of result that I'm going to get. So therefore, everything I do, my watering, my feeding, the positioning of my trees, it's all falls into line and becomes quite simple and easy to manage, relatively simple and easy to manage, because I know exactly what the result's going to be over a long period of time. So soil air is very different from above ground air in that it's got a higher concentration of carbon dioxide. But the soil air is needed by many of the microorganisms that release the plant nutrients to the soil. So you're going to find that if you're fertilising like crazy and you've got a soil mix that's very dense, like typical soil or potting mix that you buy at one of these garden centres, then you'll find that it's almost. I've got to be careful I say this. I believe it's almost useless because there's no real soil air between those very fine particles. It becomes very dense and compressed, and therefore the microorganisms can't do what they need to do to provide the nutrients from the fertilizer you're applying to the roots. So therefore you might be putting 100 bags on that are just useless, and your tree's still going to be in a very sickly state because even though you're providing it, it can't do anything with it. So there's got to be a balance between the soil air and the soil water, because the water will take the soil air away. So you need to make sure that you don't want your trees, your bonsai staying sopping wet, because that water that's in the mix is taking away the soil air that is essential. So this is why you don't, when you go away, you don't put your bonsai into a tub of water, because first thing that water is going to take away is the soil air. What's it going to do then? Take away the ability for these microorganisms to do their job. So therefore your tree's effectively going to drown. Now there's always exceptions. So I just wanted to talk about how your potting mix comes into the effectiveness of your fertilising, which is what this podcast is about. He's talking about fertiliser, and it's not to get into repotting or soil mixes or anything like that. But for me, I find that my mix of, especially the pumice and the scoria, do a really, really good job in providing those soil air, the aeration that the bonsai needs to get soil air. So it's not a fad. It's not something which will change over time. I thoroughly believe that, I've said it before, I'm always open to better suggestions as to what we can do. And this is where I love Akadama. I think it has a lot of benefits, but as that Akadama breaks down and becomes a powdery mix, the first thing it's going to take away from the bonsai inside the pot, if it's left too long between repotting cycles, is going to be those soil air cavities. If you keep your repotting frequency on track, then it's not a problem. It's same with any bonsai. You can get away with a lot as long as you're consistent about it. So I think that for me, based on affordability of the components, that I find that the mix that I use works really well, and fertilising is like I said at the very start, fertilisation of my bonsai is extremely important to me, and I'm adamant that it makes a massive difference to the overall health and well-being and the rate at which your bonsai develop. It might be the rule of the guideline of 1 to 2. One branch divides into 2. In theory, sounds great. But if your tree's not getting what it needs when it needs it, that not every branch will develop that 1 to 2. Whereas if you've got a really strong, healthy bonsai, then that 1 to 2 happens quite easily because there's enough to go around. The tree's getting what it needs. And I started the podcast by talking about, sun, water, airflow, nutrients, soil air. As long as you're ticking all of those key fundamentals of the care for your bonsai, the very basics, then pretty much you're doing a really good job, and you deserve a bit of a pat on the back, because it's over such a long period that we focus on these things. The 12-month period, everything that we do with our trees is about their development, about their structure, about their health. So repotting at the end of the dormancy period before the spring growing period for me is, okay, so focus on soil air. Let's get that part right. Why is it important? Because when I start watering, I want that water to flow through to give the trees what they need from the water component side, but I also want that air to be there, that soil air to be there in place to allow the microorganisms to do what they've got to do. So when it gets to feeding time, I can make sure that my fertilisation is going to be 100% effective. So it all sort of comes together. There's not one key aspect that we cover off with the care of our bonsais. It's so much that we do that comes together, and they're all like pieces of a puzzle that go together. And at the end of the day, the beautiful puzzle comes together to be a magnificent bonsai that you get to sit there and enjoy year after year. Right, to wrap up this podcast on fertilising primarily, I want to talk about the variation to the guideline that I use, this McDonald's approach. Now, understanding that your spring fertilising is going towards foliage growth, there's obviously got to be exceptions to the rule, because if you're providing excessive, or you're providing nutrients to a tree, it's going to result in, you're providing food to a tree, it's going to result in foliage growth. Foliage growth can get a little bit out of control. So as your tree, determining what stage of development your tree is at determines what level of fertilizer I apply. So if I look at one end of the scale, I've got a tree that's in development, just starting its life as a bonsai. It's, I'm not focusing on too much other than trunk and nabari, base root system development. It gets bucket loads of fertilizer. Bucket loads, because I want rampant growth. I want uncontrollable growth, because my focus is purely on the trunk line. Then I start moving down the line. Okay, now I'm starting to work on the primary branch structure, and I want thickening of branches in that area. It's still getting bucket loads of fertilizer, because it's not just one bag in spring. It might be 4 bags per month, because I really want to push the envelope as hard as I can to get that strong development or strong elongation or lengthening of growth to allow me to develop my primary branches. Jump somewhere down the line, and I'm starting to work on the ramification of the tree. So the tree's a lot more developed, and it's getting to a refinement stage. Then the fertilizer starts to slow down. So that initial burst in spring might be 1 bag per month, because I want to give it something, because it's still got some development to do, but it's not quite enough to be rampant growth. I don't want things to get out of control. And then as it gets towards the end of spring, so the last month or so of spring, instead of being 1 bag, it might go to 2 bags. So therefore, during the spring period, I'm going to use 4 bags on this tree, because I don't want uncontrollable growth at the start. I want to keep the strength up on this thing. But towards the end, when it's starting to run out of puff, then I want to start topping it back up again, so it goes into summer nice and healthy. So if I think about the tree's growth like a breath of air, during autumn they breathe in, they hold their breath during the winter period, and then spring comes around and they breathe out this long breath. So by the end of spring, they're almost out of breath. So it's important for me to have that as an analogy in the back of my head, that my fertilising is going to be used at a point to try and bring up the strength, like a little tail towards the end of spring for a tree that I'm topping, and then right now push it a little bit harder as it goes in towards spring. Then I get to the complete other end of the scale, where I've got a tree that's refined, that's near enough to what I'd consider perfect. It's fine, delicate growth. It's very much in control. I've got to be very careful about my fertilising on a tree like that, because too much too early, while it's still at the start of letting its breath out, that's drawn in and held, I can find that my growth gets very thick and very coarse very, very quickly. And my internode length jumps away as well, because I'm supercharging the tree. I'm giving it too much. So therefore, I might find that on a tree that's in refinement, my fertilising method might be let the first month of spring go with nothing, zero. The second month, have a look at it, keep an eye on where that growth's at. Is it starting to slow down? Is it starting to have it's had its first haircut? Make sure there's no swelling of the secondary buds that are coming after that first push of spring growth. My internode should be nice and tight by that point. Then I go through, and maybe towards the latter part of that second month of spring, then I'll give it a tea bag. And then what I'll do is that one tea bag might last the 5 or 6 week period through the following month as well. Or it might be that it might leave it for the first 3 weeks and then add another bag for the last couple of weeks of spring, just to make sure that I've got my balancing right. Now, it's not a system that I can say this is what I do every single time, because it's so many different factors to take into account. If the trees, a refined tree, has just been repotted, then the tree will be looking to push root growth, because it's got access to so much more soil there. Its roots are going to go rampant. What happens down below happens above. So if those roots start going rampant, then the foliage is going to start going rampant. So my fertilising on a refined tree that's just been freshly repotted might be it doesn't get anything until the very last part of the last month of spring, because I want to make sure that it is completely in control going into that summer period. It's got some strength, but my growth can still be managed. Whereas a tree that possibly hasn't been repotted, a refined tree hasn't been repotted for maybe 3 years, 4 years, something like that, you might find that my fertilising might actually begin at the start of spring, because the tree's nice and slow. I know that the tree roots have started to fill the cavities in the pot. The pot's becoming very, very tight. I've got to be careful with my watering. So therefore, the tree might need a little bit of a boost a bit earlier. So fertilising is one of those things that you can't write a rule book for it. It's something that you need to develop as you get to know your trees, and you'll make mistakes. You'll make mistakes, but that's where I always come back to my initial approach, the McDonald's approach, which is the safety side. 1 bag per month during the growing season of spring, with 2 during the season of autumn. So 9 bags per year per tree is a really safe guideline, and you can't go too wrong with it. But as it gets to the pointy end of your bonsai development, you're going to need to make sure that you make adjustments to it also. There's also other species. I talked about white pines before, where you've got to be careful, because that fertilisation can lead to a lengthening that can't be stopped. And if you get a tree that is not able to be, decandled or have candle cutting and back budding forced on it in some way with pruning, then you've got to be really careful about your fertilising as well. But that doesn't mean that you don't fertilise them altogether. It just means that you need to develop a technique that ensures that your tree, your bonsai, stays as healthy as it possibly can be, and you achieve the growth targets that you desire, that you want to make as well. Well, that's a wrap for this podcast. I hope no one fell asleep on that one. Like I said, it's one of those ones that I love talking about, and I find that once I start, it's pretty hard to stop. But one of the ways, or one of my approaches to showing people the benefits of fertilising, especially the first time I get to meet them, or the first time they come into my workshop, so the method that I use is to actually walk them around my garden first and say, okay, look at this. Have a look at the trees. Look how healthy they are. Look how vibrant they are. Especially now we've passed the peak of summer, and we're heading towards the end of summer now. We've still got a lot of hot weather to come. But it's when you walk around, you look at the trees, and you see how healthy they are and how lush they are, and then we sit down and go, right, now this is how I do it. This is my watering regime. This is why I water like that. This is the soil mix I use. And this is the key ingredient, which comes down to feeding your trees. So it is super important, and I hope you took something out of it as well. So just want to finish by saying thank you for everyone that's been in touch with me. Love it as always. I always finish up by saying this, but it's really nice to hear so much from so many nice people around the world, and it encourages me to continue on. And the podcast, the next edition of the podcast, I'm going to talk about the second trip that I had, the second learning trip to Japan, where I went to Kokoen in Osaka. And it was a very different trip to what I'd had when I went to Aichien in Nagoya. And it was really interesting to pick up the differences and the different approaches that people have. I mean, ultimately, it's about magnificent bonsai. And that was an absolute given. But just different approaches that people have when it comes to tree development and their focus on styling and all that sort of stuff, which I found really interesting. And it's something which I don't think a lot of people will have been able to do, is go through different nurseries and delve into their care. So I think you'll find that one really, really interesting. It's going to be another interesting podcast. So, and keep on rolling with your bonsai. Look after them. If you're towards the end of winter, start getting ready for repotting. If you're coming towards the end of summer, make sure you enjoy the warm weather and watch out for any heat waves that are coming, and give your bonsai a cuddle for me. Make sure you're spending as much time with them as you possibly can, because I know I'm loving it at the moment. There's lots of growth to work on, and I've got plenty of junipers to be pruning back. And as soon as I hit stop on this podcast, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So take care, and thank you, and happy bonsai.